Ladies and gentlemen, for the Podstarz Team Podcast, it is Jay, and I am here with the first true crime member of the Podstarz website that we have to give to you for your podcast. But I'm interviewing him today just to show you a tidbit of what you could have if you book Mr. Leigh Hunt for your podcast. He is a crime historian. He is a criminologist. He is a broadcaster. He is a member of the Society of Criminology and considered an expert on the unfortunate topic of school shootings. Again, his name is Leigh Hunt. He's an author, and he is here on the podcast today, and he's across the pond. So the time difference makes him look tired. So let's get to it. Mr. Hunt, how are you? Welcome to the show, my friend.
Jay, thanks for having me, boss. It's really cool to be here.
I'm glad to have you.
It isn't technology great. Remember the old days where we used to have to do ship-to-shore phone calls. I'm old enough to remember that. So you don't look that old, but thanks for having me.
I was born the year that you were talking about that incident that happened. So I do have some time on me. I do look a little younger than I am, but I feel older than I look. So I mean, maybe does that count for anything? I don't know. So before we
You're
get
wearing it better than I am, man.
Oh, thank you. Before we get into the crux of what you do, let's start off on a happier note. First of all, the true crime. As you know, you're on the Podstarz website. Our goal when we started the website was we knew true crime was by far the number one genre of podcasters. Like that is the thing that people want to listen to. People are drawn to true crime, whether it be like murders or kidnappings or drugs or whatever that's going on. I feel that Netflix has a big part of that right now because the documentaries they're putting out are not only amazing, but they also cover pretty much every topic that's out there, other than school shootings. So we'll get to that in a bit, though. So in your opinion, when you started to get into true crime, what did you categorize true crime is? Because it seems to have a lot of branches now. So when you got started, was it just particularly like one vein, or was it always so broad?
Well, I'm from that generation which came from the FBI sort of analysis stuff. So I'm of that age where profiling a serial killer was something that was just beyond the realms of possibility. Understanding why they did it and what they did. There was also going back to the origins of cable. There was back in when I lived in San Diego, there was the A&E network. I'm not even sure what they have in America anymore.
Still there.
There was forensic. Yeah, there's forensic files and there was FBI files. And even from the origins of cable TV, there were always this true crime stuff. And even old HBO back in the day, way back when, used to do some whodunit shows. So I've always kind of been interested in it. My father was a ripperologist. He edited a number of books about Jack the Ripper and did lots of readings from London. And I think moving to San Diego, we always had that kind of British sense of humor and that macabre. And then the crime in America was so different and sensationalized. And I think you just grow up understanding crime differently in America than you do anywhere else in the world. And of course, when those shows started hitting, I think it was just a matter of time before the world caught on. And then Netflix really raised the bar because they were doing long format documentaries and long series and really covering things. And I suppose in modern day, there's loads of great documentaries that cover true crime, but probably Making a Murderer and even the Tiger King stuff, the way they did those documentaries, leading you into the characters. And I think the origins of true crime on Netflix or in documentaries weren't really sympathetic to the victims. And I think they've come a long way now to understand that the victims play a large role in the storyline and actually understanding, what the devastating effects these crimes have on people. But as a crime historian, of course I love the documentaries, but it's hard for me to get through one without hitting the internet or buying a book or wanting to talk to the person who researched it to sort of find out the facts. And the book that I've written, I Don't Like Mondays, which is about what I consider to be the first modern school shooting, no one's ever tackled that subject. It's a difficult subject to tackle. We're happy to talk about serial killers. We're happy to talk about the TV show Snapped, which just sort of profiles women who have gone crazy. As if that's such an absurd thing. I guess it is in the realms of true crime. But, the school shooting thing is something that continues to happen, and nobody really has the right way to talk about it. It's a very difficult thing to address. It's hard to speak to victims about. It's hard to speak to people who are just, I suppose, there at the time it happens. It affects so many so quickly. Sure. That we've still got a lot to learn in the true crime space as to how to address that. Hopefully my book tackled it sensitively. But I don't, again, we all begin somewhere with true crime. I think everybody has their story. Anyone who's into true crime, all the listeners of true crime and all the people who consume its content,
Sure.
I guarantee you there's one moment if they really think back and say, that was kind of the event or the crime or something that happened to me that made me fascinated with how things tick.
Right, right.
I've also learned within being in the true crime world and the crime con community here in the UK, it's predominantly female. The vast majority of people who purchase my book are female, and I think, you know, they obviously consume information different than I do or you do for obvious reasons. And it's really, really fascinating. It has been the belief, I think, of people who don't know true crime would just assume that it's creepy men in the basements watching true crime, when actually the reality is it's not. It's highly educated and intelligent females who are watching true crime and consuming it, and that's what makes it such a fascinating genre, and that's what makes it so interesting when you communicate with your customers or your readers or your, I guess, fans to some degree, people who are more established than me. Is their take on things is very different. You know, I wrote my book from my take, and yet many of the people who've read it who are female have come back to me with a different take completely. And that's the fascinating thing about true crime. You can tell one story and have 50 different versions, and you know, and not many other genres are like that. And I think that's what makes it so powerful for podcasts.
Yeah,
you
I
can
never
pop it
thought
on.
about that. Yeah,
You can listen to the story, and you listen to it, and you might, you know, have some sort of affinity with one of the characters, or you identify with one of the people in it. And of course, you know, someone else will listen to it and hear something totally different. And I think that's what makes it such a great genre, especially when they mix female with males in the discussion, because it really opens it up to that conversation. I think some people listen to it as victims, and I know some people who listen to it thinking like the perpetrator. They identify with the perpetrator, believe it or not. That was the lure to true crime back in the 80s. You know, people would always say, how could Ted Bundy have done all those things? You know, how is it that you know, Sam Little wasn't caught earlier, or John Wayne Gacy, what a sicko? You know what I mean? But we're hard pressed to name one of their victims.
right.
And that is something that I think we need to change in true crime, and I'm trying my best to help with that.
A lot of it, I
The
guess, would
ethical
be
part.
the fascination with the psyche. Like you said, how could he have done that? How could he have done that? Like, people want to know, like, how is a human being capable of doing something like that, and then going out to a movie or going to have dinner with somebody, knowing that, you know, an hour ago they just did something disgustingly horrible, right? Like, it's crazy.
Well,
Like, how does that work?
for centuries, people have been trying to diagnose, you know, this type of I guess brain damage, because we assume anyone who kills is brain damage, anybody who does this, but we know that that's not true. They live completely normal lives, and you know,
Right.
BTK is a great example of someone who was really under the radar, and he was doing horrible things in his free time, mind, torture, kill. His name's Raider from Wichita. He's probably one of the most horrible killers in American history, and he lived a very, very normal life and was, I think, a deacon at his church when he was finally arrested years later. So this idea that you can pick out a psychopath, it's just, those days are long gone. You don't know who they are, and they're all around us.
Right.
And I think that's what makes it so frightening, makes it especially frightening for women, is the fact that they're quite often the victims of these type of crimes. And crimes against women is, you know, it's difficult to understand, and it's difficult to fix as well. We're trying so hard in this country to stop crimes against women, but it continues and continues. Understanding the psychology of a killer, that's a tough one, and I would even argue that putting them all into categories has not helped. I would say that the FBI's profiling, great. I think it's fascinating, it's interesting, but they didn't catch a lot of people with that profiling. All of the stuff that they put together is great. It's a fascinating read, and I love the shows they make, and I love Douglas's books. I think it was enormously influential in my life to read that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But looking back at it, they didn't catch a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
So putting them into categories is great. For science, it's fantastic. It helps us to understand what happened, you know, post conviction. But actually, in stopping the serial killer, or in stopping the spree killer, and certainly in stopping the mass shooter or school shooter, none of that profiling, none of the psychology, none of the changes to the law has had any positive effect at all. And that's coming from a crime historian who just studies the facts. I'm not studying the whys, it's just what's happened.
Right.
And it's something that it's difficult when I do my reading or my writing or my speeches to sort of say, you know what? 45 years after the Cleveland shooting in San Diego, the I Don't Like Monday shooting, which almost started it all, or 25 years since Columbine or whatever, we are literally no closer to the answer. And in fact, I would say even further away. While I was writing my book, I was writing a chapter about how heroic the police officers were in San Diego in 1979, where they were running into the scene, not knowing where the shooter was or what kind of armory they had, having no idea of what the threat was, without bulletproof vests, without modern technology. They were running into the scene. At the same time I was writing that, police officers in Uvalde were running away from the scene.
That was disgusting.
So, and again, I know that's an isolated instance. So that's a one-off. That doesn't happen a lot. And it wasn't as if they were running away in fear. They just didn't know, giving them some credit, because being a first responder is the hardest job in the world. It was fascinating to watch that on the news and hear all the criticism of police officers in Texas, while I'm literally writing a chapter about how heroic they were in Southern California. And again, there's 45 years apart from those two incidences, and nothing's changed. So there you go. Quick rundown for you about my book and what I study.
No, I definitely want to get in, dive a little deeper into that. I guess one of the questions I have for you is, I know true crime for me, I accidentally fell into liking it when I was in grade 8 or 9. I came from a single family, so my mom was always at work. So when I got assigned schoolwork, my mom really didn't know what was going on, unless like she got a letter home saying that it wasn't done or something like that. So we were assigned book reports. I wandered into the library and I grabbed a book. And it's funny that you brought up Jack the Ripper, because that's the book that I found. Me thinking this was an entertaining book, maybe a comedy or something lighthearted. I had no idea what I was actually holding. So here I am trying to decipher what I'm reading and getting bits and parts and trying to understand it. And I wrote a book report on Jack the Ripper, and it was in grade 8, I guess, because it was before junior high. And then, of course, the teacher saying, like, looking at me like as if I'm sort of macabre individual, like, grade 8. And, my mom gets called in. And then I started to understand, the gravity of the situation. This really happened. So once I realized that this guy was real and he was terrorizing women around London for so long and still uncaught, it grabbed me. And I started right from there. I was like, I'm going to read everything I can get my hands on as far as, true crime. So I'm not into it as much as you are, obviously, because you're doing it as a career, but I definitely see the draw to it.
It's what we don't understand. And there's the great saying that, truth is stranger than fiction. And every time something else happens within the crime community, or a new crime happens, or again, the American press over the last 6 months, you've had some remarkable national cases. This has been a remarkable year in the United States, and it's hard not to watch what's happening over there. It's fascinating, some of the cases you have that are dominating the news. And this stuff, if you wrote that down in fiction, people would go, but because it's real, it forces you to have to accept the reality of what it is. And I think Jack the Ripper is a very, very interesting one, because the summer of 1888 is so long ago, but yet we can cast our minds back and we can visualize what that must have looked like, and what it must have been for the victims, or what Jack the Ripper must have been able to do, and especially the night of the double murders. We're getting the details of Jack the Ripper. There are many now. Steve Keogh is a Met police officer. He's written a book suggesting it's a number of different killers, that Jack the Ripper wasn't just one killer, that it isn't just one guy. There's the great book 5. I want to say, I forget her name. I want to say Haley Rubenhold wrote a wonderful book called 5, where she disputes the fact of them being sex workers in London. In fact, they were just women out on their own at that time of the evening, which is very possible as well. So even 50 years later, Jack the Ripper is as a theory alive and well. And even though your book report, let's count it way back, 40 years ago, whatever that was, it's still just as topical today as it was in, you know what I mean? And I think that's the wonder of true crime. As long as it's unsolved, the story can be told many times over and over and over again, and the fascination will not dwindle. It's a remarkable genre, for sure. And that's the great use of Jack the Ripper, because I think that's the one. Lizzie Borden and Jack the Ripper were the two that started it for me, in a way. They were the first ones I read full books. the first book I read cover to cover was a Martin Fido, Jack the Ripper, and sort of story thing, and I loved it. And I think I've still got it in my bookshelf. And I bumped into him at a book festival not too long ago, and I didn't have my original copy at a first edition. I really wanted Martin Fido to sign it. He's a legend in the Jack the Ripper world. But anyway, sorry, I digress. You mentioned Jack the Ripper. You started it, Jay. You started it.
No. Hey,
you got me going.
It was the first book I ever read too, like cover to cover, other than like Curious George or something like that. It was an actual like novel. So yeah, we shared that same trait, which is unbelievable, actually.
Yeah.
So how about?
That's cool. I think the true crime's come a long way since Jack the Ripper and the way it interprets it. The way
For sure.
Some of the old, the books of the 1970s are very different than the way they're written today. And the amount of police officers who are writing books or former detectives who are writing books now, the insights we're getting in the crime community is so far more elaborate and in depth and interesting. And I think it's because the reader is far more intelligent. It's come a long way from Forensic Files on A&E channel at midnight when I was a 9-year-old insomniac watching cable. I love that show. It's still the daddy of all the crime shows. It's still my favorite.
And now that they can add, obviously DNA and lie detectors and all this other great stuff, like that we never had back in 1994, so it makes the shows that much more entertaining, knowing that. Well, we know that within the first 48, which was not a thing back in the day until that show started. I never knew the first 48 was like the thing, right? So now we know all these things. They're ingrained into us. So I mean, Netflix and A&E, who's like you said, A&E's still around. They still have great crime shows, but very entertaining.
Here in the UK, here in the UK, there's a really good one called 24 Hours of Police Custody. Because the law here is you have 24 hours to charge someone.
Okay.
And it literally is like the first 48. They've arrested someone, and now this is their first 24 hours in custody. What do they do? The trail that they take, how they gain evidence. The way they're doing documentaries now are just fantastic. And it's putting crime historians out of business, because in the old days we wrote books and we wrote papers and we submitted them into literary forums. Now television is doing it, showing us so much in an hour and a half. They're brilliant. Some of the shows are fantastic. Not all of them are fantastic. Some of them are, I'm not a huge fan of, some of the stuff that's come out on Netflix lately. That's especially with the stalking genre of stalking. I don't think they're doing victims much favors in that respect. But for the most part, it's a far more intelligent genre than any other. Than any other. I'm giggling because a lot of people in the crime world love Married at First Sight. Is that popular in the USA?
Well, I'm in Canada, but
Canada. Sorry,
there is like you brought up earlier. It's a lot of older ladies, like in their 30s, 40s, who watch it before bed. But I've never actually seen the show, but I know it's popular.
Well, there's the Australian version and the British version, and we giggle about it in the crime community because we read about psychopaths, we speak to psychopaths every day. We break bread with them, we study them,
right?
And yet, Married at First Sight seems to have their fair share of people who are going through their own type of psychopathy. They're not the murderer type, they're not the killers, but they certainly have their own issues that make them, some of them, quite narcissist. It's quite a brilliant show to watch if you study the human condition. I'm not a psychologist. It's not my area of expertise, but I am constantly fascinated with shows like that. We have another one here called Love Island. Fascinated with the type of person who wants to be associated with that show, who wants to be known for that show, who's looking for fame at all costs.
Is that the one where they deduct you for kissing?
I'm not making.
And my mom, I think my mom watches that, but okay.
Yeah. Again, not my area of expertise, but we often talk about different people, and we, the amount of suicides of people who come off those programs as well is starting to rise and become an issue. And people used to come off the old Jerry Springer show as well. The type of person who was looking for that kind of fame. I'm not making a connection between those type of people and mass shooters, but there certainly was an association, for me anyway, in the 80s and 90s, where people who committed atrocious crimes were doing it for fame or some type of affirmation of some kind.
Right.
I think I'd be wrong to say that still continues that way, but I don't know. people are, people who commit horrible crimes have their own challenges, but I do find them sometimes to be similar with people who are on those shows. And that's controversial. Again, not my area of expertise, and maybe I don't want to be pinned down to that for too long, but I do sometimes find some similarities between the two of those things.
I understand. So when you wrote this book, obviously you had to do some deep diving into the world of the unfortunate school shooting incident and incidents that are still happening, like we talked about earlier. Um, I was a correctional officer for 12 years, so I saw some horrible things that I couldn't take away with any amount of alcohol in the world. I would assume that the stuff that you're learning about would have a similar effect to you. How do you decompress? How do you take that and keep it out of your personal life, because it does start to creep in at some point because it's such a negative thing.
It's funny because I think the first 10 years that I just read about crime is I was completely disconnected from the victims. I was literally, because I was a young man, I was thinking like the killer. For example, if I was reading something about Ted Bundy, whenever I read the story, I was kind of imagining me being Ted Bundy doing those things. And I was reading the stories like that. And it wasn't for about 10 years after reading dozens and dozens and dozens of books that I finally kind of had that epiphany of like, wait a second, I've been reading these books from the wrong narrative. Nothing in the book was written as the killer. It was always written from someone on the sidelines. Yet my brain was interpreting it as if I was the killer. I always thought to myself, hold on, I'll be honest. Was I reading these books to fight my own demons? By reading these books, was it stopping me from wanting to commit crimes? I've since found that isn't the case. It was more that I was so intrigued about how they work, like how their brain went from, I've committed a crime and now I'm energized to do it again, or I feel the urge to do it again, as opposed to feeling, some sort of shame or having some sort of compassion for the victim.
Right.
And they just didn't. And the books you read over, and there were hundreds of these books and hundreds of killers. It wasn't until I started communicating with the killers themselves, so I just finally said, look, I'm going to write one and ask a few questions, that I suddenly had this epiphany that they are just normal people who have a side of them that is the devil. And I kind of just had to separate myself from those things and go, okay, look, I cannot get caught up in the way that they think. I'm gonna take everything they say with a pinch of salt, as if they're lying to me. I just literally had to kind of readjust myself. I put the books down for about 6-7 months. I stopped communicating with anybody in prison, and I just stepped back, focused on my radio stuff that I was doing. There was all the hit music and all the stuff that I was doing on the radio. It's so much easier to tune out when you're listening to rubbish, top 40, than reading crime books. And that's what I kind of did. I just took my 6 months off, readjusted myself, and then came back with a more kind of thinking of the victims rather than of the killer. And I think globally, television shows and books made that shift at the same time. Because I think we went from being, listen to what this awful guy did. Oh, this little guy did this and this guy did that, to being, on this day the victim suffered this. And the whole ton of it changed. I think a lot of people went through that same kind of epiphany that I did. It was probably around mid to late 90s, I guess it was for me. I think I was in my 30s. So, I think everybody kind of has them. And again, when the FBI were describing what a serial killer looked like, they were describing me. A lot of times with brown hair, brown eyed, 6 foot tall, white male. This was like this generic serial killer that they were describing. It was hard not to go, hold on a second, and just, whether it's Dahmer or Bundy or so many others, they were describing essentially me, and I kind of just had to step back. So, and even now, I communicate with a murderer who I'm working on a project with him and some of the victims. And he was one of the youngest serial killers in American history. And actually, I think he is the youngest in Rhode Island. He is the youngest serial killer in American history convicted. He was 13 when he committed his first murder. And there were times when I'm speaking to him where I kind of, okay, whoa. I've spoken to a number of killers and written about a number of them, and I've never kind of gotten the spooks. There were a few times when speaking to him, just having general conversation, where I went, oh, okay, this is real. This guy is this guy is pure evil. And there's moments where I do just have to stop, put it down, stop reading true crime. I watch some rubbish television, I focus on some of my other projects I've got going that aren't with crime, and I come back to it a week later. And you have to do it. And I think every couple of years you reset. You have to.
Right.
And when I'm with people who are into, who are other crime researchers and writers, when we get together, we do talk about true crime. And then we all kind of stop for 5 seconds. And anyway, okay. So about, we start talking about American football, or we start talking about soccer, we start talking about something else, because I think we all kind of catch ourselves. You just can't do it 24/7. It will take you. You need to take your breaks.
Makes sense. Makes sense. You said that guy from Rhode Island was 13. How old is he now?
50 now.
Oh, he's 50.
He's 50.
50? Oh, wow.
He's 50 now. Yeah, he was his first serial killing was at 13. He committed another crime at 15, and he was swiftly arrested, and he's been in prison ever since. He was moved from Rhode Island and now down in Florida. And the crimes he committed are some of the most horrific crimes I've ever heard. They are truly horrific. And the amount of people who suffered from his murders are far and wide. In the state of Rhode Island, had never seen anything before or anything after it. And he's actually in prison for attempted murder. He attempted to kill someone he was incarcerated with. He actually was released from his murder charges at 21, because Rhode Island doesn't keep people after 21 who are juveniles who commit crimes. So literally a 13-year-old serial killer would have been free at 21 years old if the law hadn't changed and there hadn't been some interventions. And of course, if he wasn't a naughty boy whilst in prison, he has trouble controlling himself. But it's an amazing story. The victims, the family, their strength, Rhode Island's, the way they rallied together to protect their community. They're despite all the horrific story of the murders of what this guy committed, actually the community bonded together and showed a lot of strength. So it's a silver lining for Rhode Island. But yeah, a very horrible story. I'm not saying his name. I'm not saying his name intentionally. Yeah. Okay. Because the last thing I want, again, we know Ted Bundy, we know John Wayne Gacy, we know Dahmer. We struggle to name any of their victims, and that's a narrative that I'm trying to change. So it's learning for me too.
Yeah, you don't hear very much about Rhode Island, so it's a shame that has to be tied in with that little tiny blip on the American map. But so, yeah.
Yeah, it's again, if you said Rhode Island, you don't think of, when you think of all the American states, but they have crime too, and there's no town in the world that doesn't have some horrible story to share of some description. Just the reality of true crime. If you look hard enough for it, you'll find it.
Yeah, no, it's just a matter of how far they bury it.
Yeah. Won't get into the conspiracy stuff. Although I do love a good conspiracy. Let's not get into one.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, because that'll take us down a rabbit hole.
There's enough going around now with social media. Conspiracies have turned a corner. Boy, when I was a kid, we had Kennedy, and that was about it. Now with the internet, make a list. The conspiracies are coming fast and furious. We had Bigfoot. We had Loch Ness Monster. We didn't have a whole lot of great conspiracies or crazy stuff, but now loads of it. I don't know if I like it or hate it, but it certainly keeps you entertained.
Moon landing, flat Earth.
Oh yeah,
vaccinations. Yeah. Kennedy. Joe Biden's not real. He's an actor with a mask on. So 9/11. Yeah.
No. I saw one the other year that I thought was the best thing I ever heard. Somebody actually believes that Stephen King shot John Lennon. There's a website, and he's written a book.
King, the author?
Proving. Steve, yeah.
He's an assassin?
Believe the most. Well, he vaguely looks like the guy who was convicted for it. And I think that's pretty much his premise. I don't know. Jack the Ripper, go back to that. People have I read a book about someone saying the Elephant Man was Jack the Ripper because he lived in the same neighborhood. So people believe what they want to believe. People make up what they, it's fine. And misinformation it's one of the pillars of our society now. It's here to stay. And we just, I think it's why I finally wrote my book about about I don't like Mondays and that school shooting is there's Wikipedia is awash of false information.
Sure. Yeah.
Almost in regards to that school shooting, virtually every line on Wikipedia I've been able to dispute with pictures and other information, just almost line for line.
Right.
We often take the criminal and want to put them into certain categories because it makes us feel better. You want to believe that they hurt animals, or that they burned cats' tails, or that they were on drugs, or that their dad was this, or we always want to believe those things because it makes it easy for us to understand it. Even though the reality is, some people just do evil things,
Just wired wrong,
and then go right back to normalcy the next day. That's even harder to comprehend, and that's probably why we don't say it in those terms, because that's hard to understand. But it's reality. It's the facts.
Sure.
And history proves it.
So the book that you wrote, that's aptly named "I Don't Like Mondays," fantastic title, obviously, or tagline. I don't know how, like a wrestler sort of. That's her tagline, I would assume. The book that you wrote,
mine. I got it from her.
No, yeah, I hope not. Or Garfield stole it as well. Anyways, so you wrote the book. Was it because that story really grabbed you, or was it because more or less that you said that no one had covered it and you wanted to kind of uncover some of the details of what had actually happened?
It's actually deeper rooted than that. I'm glad you asked the question. My father was the city editor for the Evening Tribune in San Diego. We had just moved to the United States as kids from England. We were living the American dream. Now imagine a family. My mom was from Nottingham, my dad's from North London. Imagine us living in San Diego as little kids. I mean, we went from a rained out country that was, Britain in the 70s was full of strikes and blackouts, and it was a real mess of a country at the time. Moving to San Diego was like paradise.
Right.
And I think San Diego still is paradise. It's a beautiful city. So we moved there, and we were living the American dream. My dad was working as an editor in the newspaper. My mom was working in the hospitals. And one day we were at school, and I was 10 years old. I just turned 10. And our school was sort of locked down. And there was a moment where the teachers had all spoken, and we kind of all looked at each other like, what's going on? And we understood that something was happening. But at that time we were doing stop, drop, and roll, sort of, I'm trying to think of the word. We were practicing for big emergencies, for Russian invasions. There were all this stuff that was going on in the 70s. It was a strange time where we were doing all kinds of drills. So we didn't think anything of it. I got home that night, and my dad said, I've got to tell you a story, because he was working that morning and he got a phone call from the people working down at the police station saying, we've got a shooter in our town. Of course, this had never happened before. There'd never been a school shooting before. Mass shootings were something that didn't happen like this, and certainly didn't happen to people who were living the American dream. It was immigrants. And he called over, his team called over, looking for anybody in the area. They'd heard that these gunshots were shooting into this elementary school and children were being shot. And they just called any house in the area. And one of the houses they called was the perpetrator. And she was a 16-year-old girl. And she picked up the phone, and they spoke to her. And they said, they spoke for a little bit. What are you doing? What's going on? She said, it's me. I'm shooting across the street. And they said, why are you doing that? And they said, well, I don't like Mondays. And this livens up the day. And that's the famous quote she told the reporters. Now, as the students who were being shot and other victims were being sent to various hospitals around that area, my mom was working in the hospital. So that evening when we got home, my dad had a remarkable story to say, I've spoken to my first killer today. And my mom came saying, well, we've seen gunshots before, but not so many at one time for people so young. And we kind of sat down as a family and had this kind of family discussion that, one of the things that we're going to have to deal with, coming from Britain to America, is guns.
Right.
This is going to be part of our day. And it scarred me as a child, and it scarred my dad. My dad was, wow, he's written, and edited dozens and dozens of articles. He's a Pulitzer Prize winning editor. But this is the one that kind of made us all talk. And whenever we discuss Jack the Ripper or discuss all the other, things that were on TV and the macabre that was happening in true crime, we always went back to that story. So when I was finishing up some of my criminology studies, and it was like, what was the story that needs to be told? I just said, you know what? No one's ever spoken to her. No one's ever, spoken to the cops that were at the scene. Nobody's ever gone in depth as to how it happened, how they solved it. I managed to find the original audio recordings from the police dispatches. It's the first recording of a school shooting in American history. I've got those. I own the copyright to those, and I managed to transcribe them into the book and actually follow the events from start to finish. This is what first responders did before there was a first responder handbook. This is what cops did when they just had to act as heroes rather than from a guidebook or from a training or from a first responder instructional. And I tell that story. The first half of the book is that. The second half of the book is the perpetrator, where she came from, where she grew up, what's the truth, what's not the truth, her parents, her brothers and sister, her relationships whilst in prison, her relationships out of prison. She's still in prison now. She's got a parole hearing next year. She's never been allowed to, to even see the light of day yet, and don't know that she will. But then that being said, in California, they're releasing numbers of prisoners. San Quentin is essentially closed, and death row is now closed, and a number of two school shooters that I speak with have now left San Quentin and now at different prisons and off death row. Mm-hmm. So it is possible that very, very soon in the next couple of years, school shooters who have murdered multiple people will be released to the public. And actually, I would say to you that it's a certainty that you don't be surprised that in the next 2 years you hear about a very famous school shooter living within their old community or a new community somewhere in California. They've released one of the Manson sisters. They've gone out, and it's just our reality. We have to trust rehabilitation at this stage. We really have to trust it. So that's what the book's about. It's essentially the very, very first school shooting, who she was, and it's a girl. It's not the typical trench coat mafia or the other nonsense that they want you to believe what a school shooter looks like. There is no description for a mass shooter or a school shooter. They are of all shapes and sizes. Majority men, but there are women who do it. And one of the first in American history was a female. She changed the world, I think, that day. Bob Geldof wrote the song "I Don't Like Mondays," which is a massive hit throughout the world. Got a number of chapters about Sir Bob himself and why he chooses to call himself Sir Bob, and his life and how it changed his life and what he did afterwards. It plays a tale in it because we all know I don't like Mondays because of the song. It may be that she would have slipped into obscurity and no one would ever talk about that horrific crime she committed if the song were never written. I don't know. It's history. It is what it is. And I think the story had to be told. And I wish I'd written the book 20 years ago.
Right. Yeah. So without getting too political, well, first, before we go there, what was the weapon that she used?
He had a Ruger 22, a long rifle with a scope, advertised in the 1970s as your starter rifle or the woman's gun, your wife's weapon. Okay. It was advertised as a low caliber 22, which it is. And I think to people who own guns, and I'm not authority on guns, but I've read a lot about them. It's a very low caliber weapon. She used it with extraordinary effect and with near expert marksmanship. Wow. She hit the target she wanted to. She killed the custodian and the principal with 2 shots each to the chest, right in the heart, killed them both, shot a police officer in the neck. All the children were luckily struck in hands and along the lower midsection or the legs or the arm. But all the men and police officers and people of authority were shot directly in the chest or neck. So we conclude she might be the luckiest shot of all time. Very possible. But I tend to believe that she was taking aim at targets, and the bigger targets got the most precise shots. And it proves that no matter how large the weaponry, you can still kill.
Right. That's a sad reality as well. I mean,
it is, and I think that it gets to the political argument if we're segueing into that now.
Yeah, I mean, that's where I was going with that. I mean, the AR-15 apparently is obviously the number one. Like, I want to say number one with a bullet. I guess that kind of fits actually. That's the gun that everyone is like, you don't need this to have in your home, and like, I mean, I know things are different across the pond, but I mean, because you fly back and forth from the US to the UK, you're involved in this argument. So where do you stand? What do you think?
Well, I believe in the right to bear arms, flat out.
Okay.
I'm I'm not a gun owner. I'm not a lover of guns. There's nothing that I need in Britain to protect my home. I don't need a weapon, but I respect the Constitution. I respect the United States. I respect the right to bear arms. I think changing that is something that will not happen. That being said, an AR-15, a bazooka, hand grenades,
Yeah.
plastic explosives. We need to really have a serious conversation as to what that means. What is somebody foreign and domestic? What exactly does that mean?
Right.
Parents who give their children weapons should be held accountable. I believe that because gun ownership, as I knew it when I lived in California, was a responsibility, and you need to be a responsible owner. And we've had mass shootings in Britain as well, and significantly, we've had 5 major events over the last 45 years, and with each one of them, Parliament has changed the laws to make gun ownership more restrictive.
Right.
Significant changes to the law. We still have another large mass shooting in Plymouth 3 years ago, which shocked everybody, but that was for mismanagement of somebody who was allowed to own a shotgun, not because the law was incorrect. It was because it wasn't being maintained by the police locally. But they still went ahead and changed the law and made it even stricter. So my feeling here is that, I think gun ownership is an American right. I believe that. I'm not in a position to tell anybody that it isn't. I'll leave that to people who want to argue that politics. But I would say, if you're allowing your 16-year-old child to travel across state lines into an open carry state with a large semi-automatic rifle with the intent to hurt somebody, that's not the right to bear arms. That, to me, is not protecting your family.
Right.
That is not protecting your livelihood or defending your children or defending your spouse. That is sheer aggression, and that is not what the amendment was written for. And that's how I interpret that. But again, you've got 50 states with 50 laws.
Right.
But historically, countries that have made more restrictive gun laws have less victims in their mass shooting events.
Well,
so the larger the weapon, England's a great example, but even so, I mean, in Europe as well, and the Czech Republic has had its own share, and Norway and Australia, other countries around the world are having these things happen where people are obtaining larger weapons and causing some destruction. But the evidence, to me, as a crime historian, shows the larger the weapon, the larger amount of casualties you will have during that event. Columbine is an example where they built bombs and stockpiled. If it weren't for the fact that they were 2 absolute morons, there could have been far more deaths at Columbine. And I say morons because they were. I'm not going to give them any credit at all. They stormed into a building thinking they were gods and they were larger than life and they were going to kill people in the car park and take out half the building. And they ended up making idiots of themselves and having to take their own lives for the failure that they committed at the school. And they left hundreds of victims around that town and changed the world. So I feel nothing for the shooters and the ones that stockpile weapons for days and weeks. Yeah, there you go. I think that's politics. There you go.
Makes sense.
And that's not choosing sides politically. That's just, I think that's a reasonable, moderate stance. I'm hardly breaking any rules by saying that. I'm not going Republican or Democrat or anything. I think there is a normalcy within the middle in America where people can say, hold on a second now. Let's put some common sense to this. And I'm not suggesting that everybody who lives way up in in Green Bay, Wisconsin, where they go hunting twice a year, should have their weapons taken from them. That's not what I'm saying.
Right.
That's not what I'm saying. I'm just suggesting, what is the right to bear arms? What does that actually mean? Giving your children weapons to travel state lines is not the right to bear arms. There we go.
So That's the second time you said the right to bear arms and the traveling across state lines. Are you specifically talking about the Rittenhouse situation, or is that just a
Yes, I am,
okay?
but
I thought so.
there's multiple situations just like that. Yeah, I am talking about the Rittenhouse because he was made out to be a hero. And I just don't, I don't get it. I don't get that part of it. Historically, it's great in in an election year to make to show your allegiance to the NRA or whatever. That's great. But actually, if you really look at what's happened here, there's no other country in the world that would stand for that. And actually, maybe two other states wouldn't stand for it either.
Right.
It's just at that moment, at that time. That's just my opinion. It's just my opinion. I don't get it. I don't understand that.
And I agree with you 100%. When I heard what he had did and I heard how it all ended, I couldn't correlate the two things. It didn't make any sense to me whatsoever. It still doesn't. And the fact that he's on Twitter, talking a big game and this and that. I mean, it burns me, man. It burns me. And but anyways, that's a rabbit hole.
I just don't understand. I think that's what it is. And maybe I don't know enough about the case. Maybe I haven't studied it long enough, but just, again, objectively from 5,000 miles away, what's going on over there?
Right.
What? Anyway, I think a lot of Americans think the same. And I think even people who defend the right to bear arms, like I do, would look at that and go, that's not doing us any favors.
Oh, for sure. I mean, there's one thing about being able to say that this is our right, and then there's another seeing that and saying that is also your right. They're not the same thing. Like they're just not. Like, no matter how you frame it, it just doesn't work like that.
Yeah. It's a tough one to go. It's tough because I think it's what's your intent? What's you carrying a weapon with an intent? Right. If you're entering my house and I draw my weapon, my intent is to defend myself. If I'm running, again, I'm not going to say it again, but traveling such a distance with large weaponry, what's your intent?
Yep, I agree. So before I let you go, I want to give you this opportunity to promote yourself, where people can find you, where they can buy your book, and maybe even if you want to throw a breadcrumb about what you're working on now. I think maybe you alluded to it earlier with the killer that you were talking to, but feel free to talk what you have going on.
As if I haven't promoted myself enough in this, Jay. But thank you for the opportunity. My favorite subject, other than true crime, is myself. So thank you.
Oh, there you go.
NLeighHunt.com is the website if you want to get a hold of me. You can also just Google Leigh Hunt. I'll come up. I'm on Revolution Radio, Horizon Radio in Milton Keynes and Northampton. If you ever up late at night, Nick at night, over the graveyard shift, give me a listen. Give me a call. I'd love to hear from you. I'm working on a bunch of stuff, actually. I've got 3 projects going right now. I've just come back from Cokeville, Wyoming. I've been studying a hostage crisis that happened there in 1986. Just got all my FBI files on that. And that's like crack for me. Getting FBI files and getting 500 pages of FBI jibber jabber. I love going through it, deciphering it, reading it, highlighting it. It's just proper geek fest for me. I absolutely love that. I'm in the middle of that. I've got some interviews to go with that too. I've just began a new podcast about what looks to be a dubious conviction of a woman in Florida called Amanda Lewis, who was sentenced to life in prison for drowning her 7-year-old daughter. We did some research. We recreated the pool and tried to reenact the crime and found it virtually impossible to have been able to commit the crime as she was convicted. The pool collapses. She was convicted on testimony of her 6-year-old son, who was taken from her, and she's never seen him since, and he now lives with a foster family. It's something about it just didn't smell right to me. The amount of women who are victims and incarcerated in Florida is really it's amazing how many are incarcerated for defending themselves. That's another thing I'm covering there in that podcast, and then I've got a whole bunch of CrimeCon stuff going on. So I'm part of the CrimeCon community in the UK. CrimeCon in America is just it's just amazing out there. The people who organize it. Are you aware of CrimeCon?
Yeah, one just passed. I think it was Nashville.
Yeah. The next one's going to be in Denver next year, and it's just if you're into true crime and you really want to geek out for a weekend, you can go and see some amazing people talk about amazing stories from past to present on television. They're on all your podcast creators are on it. It's a really great thing. I'm part of that here in the UK. We've got one coming up in September, which I'll be going to. I just came back from Glasgow and did stuff up there. Told my story about I Don't Like Mondays. Speaking of the book, you can find it on Amazon. You can find it anywhere. Just Google I Don't Like Mondays book. It's the story of the first modern school shooting in America. And you can always reach me on my website. And if you've got any questions, I'll probably be around. You can find me. I'm on social media as well.
Okay, well, there you go, folks. And like he said, the CrimeCon is so big. We actually have many members of the CrimeCon community already on this site. Mr. Hunt is another one. We have CSI experts, we have lawyers, we have NYPD, we have FDNY, we have many, many authors. We Podstarz is really committed to all of the true crime podcasters. And I also want to say that you don't have to be a true crime podcaster to talk to somebody who's involved in true crime. That's the beautiful thing about podcasting. Mix it up a bit, show some people that you're able to change and to pivot, and talk to some interesting people who have interesting things to say. And obviously, true crime being the #1 genre of podcasting in the world. So, Mr. Hunt, thank you very much, sir. Congratulations on all your success. You own a pub as well, which is awesome. You take true crime and you own a pub. So I like how you put those things together. Very well.
Well, they do. They go together in a weird kind of way. They go together in a weird kind of way.
It's true crime and a
Jay,
pint.
thank you for having me. I love the idea of Podstarz. I think it's fantastic. I'm so glad to be part of your community. Thank you for having me. And you need anything else from me, you know where to find me. And and if you're ever over in London, you gotta look me up, man. I know a few cool places to take you. I can get you a decent pint.
All right, I will come to your bar and we will go for a jaunt. We will go some true crime hunting and I will go with you. All right, sir. Thank you very much. Have a fantastic day and we will talk again soon. Bye for now.